Well, our next speaker is Chaplain Squadron Leader, Reverend Dr. Nikki Coleman. She is the only one that gets to abbreviate her chaplaincy as CHAP. We don't get to do that. We don't get to put our rank into parentheses. She gets to do that. We don't get to put our military or our college degrees or any other titles as part of our title, and we don't even get that spiffy kangaroo in our symbol the way she does as well. But I had the privilege to meet her at the International Society of Military Ethics, where I was representing the Civil Air Patrol in Cleveland several years ago in a very cold and wintry day. Summer for you down in Australia, but it was certainly cold in winter January for us. She's taught military ethics to cadets and midshipmen at the Australian Defence Force Academy for 10 years. She's taught military bioethics at the Australian National University, Case Western Reserve, and Yale. She has a PhD in military ethics and is a team leader for the University of New South Wales, thank you, Canberra Space Ethics Research Team, as well as running the International Space Ethics Collaborative Research Group. And her current research interests are obedience in the military bioethics, moral injury, PTSD, and space ethics, focusing on mitigating the risk of the disruptive use of space by non-state groups. And next year, she will have 2 books published, one on military space ethics and one on obedience in the military. Chaplain Coleman, thank you so very much for blessing us with your time. The microphone is yours, ma'am.
Thank you very much. And first I have to say thank you to inviting me, and sirs, it was fantastic to see your presentation. I actually kind of don't know how I follow such an inspiring presentation and that video, but I'll try. So thank you. Oh, and actually my very first question, I was going to ask this before, but because I have the microphone, I decided to ask later, which is, will you take lateral transfers from the Australian Air Force? My husband's American and 2 of my kids are American, but it's very exciting what you're going to be doing both within Space Force and also within the Civil Air Patrol supporting Space Force. So it's very exciting. So the first thing that I have to start with is my disclaimer. So these views are my own opinions and analysis and not are an official position of the Royal Australian Air Force, University of New South Wales, Canberra, Case Western Reserve, or the Air Power Development Centre. So the other thing I need to say is that all the material that I'm presenting to you is sourced publicly and is unclassified. So you're very welcome to use any of these slides. I have another talk which I will send to you, which is a YouTube, it's a video that's just gone up onto YouTube, which is actually a more in-depth introduction to military space ethics, and I think you'll find that useful. If you want the slides from that, I'm happy to send those as well. So as Chaplain Minor mentioned, I'm a bit unusual. In terms of chaplaincy, I'm what they call, in Australia, we call me the unicorn, because I sort of don't fit in anywhere, but I tend to work everywhere and nowhere, which is great. So my role is as the senior chaplain ethicist to the Air Force. And because there's no ethicist in the Army or the Navy, it means that I do a lot of work with them as well. So I'm the ethicist to all of the Australian Defence Force, but primarily to the Royal Australian Air Force. I split my time. Part of my time is spent as a chaplain, as a regular chaplain, as much as any chaplain is regular. So I work with our Joint Operations Command and also our VIP squadron, which would be the equivalent to your squadron that looks after the president, for example. And in that role, I also work directly with our Director General of Chaplaincy and, for example, prepare briefs, decision briefs for him for our Chief of Air Force. So that's part of my job in chaplaincy. My job as an ethicist is a bit ever growing. So I look after all sorts of areas in ethics. This year has been not what I expected. So I expected to actually be working mainly on space ethics, But what I've actually been working on is military medical ethics and bioethics. So the Air Force lent me out to go and work with our Department of Health to write our triage guidelines. So who gets a ventilator and who gets a palliative care should our health system be overrun. So that was a bit of a surprise, but it's an area that I'm trained in and have a lot of experience in, and so the Air Force was able to lend me out. So the three main areas, as I mentioned before, as was mentioned before, that I work in are general military ethics. So I particularly look at obedience in the military, moral injury and PTSD, military medical ethics. And so a lot of my work in that area is looking at supporting research on our military personnel, medical research, to make sure it's done in an ethical way and all of that. But my passion, my love, and why I'm here today is my love of space ethics. So I've actually been a military space ethicist for the last 6.5 years. So I'm very lucky that when the UNSW Canberra, the university, stood up a space department, they actually put on some ethicists, and I was one of those too. And so I've been exceedingly lucky that that has given me a wonderful opportunity. So a lot of my work has been looking at the ethical issues of what our department does, looking at space ethics issues in general, and working with groups like NASA, the Japanese space, so JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, the European Space Agency, and so on, in an ad hoc manner. But when they have an ethical issue, sometimes they'll reach out to me, which I've really loved. So I give you all of this information just so you understand where I'm coming from. The one thing I'll say is I can't see any questions that are popping up, so because of the way my screens are set up. So if you do have a question, feel free, Chaplain Minor, to interrupt and to ask whatever question.
Ma'am, we're gonna wait to the end of your presentation and ask.
Okay.
Go for it.
Fantastic. So what are we doing today? So what my goal, honestly, I could talk all day about any of these things and get you all excited about them. But my goal today is to give you a brief overview of military ethics in general, and which is why I spoke about what a military ethicist such as myself does within a department, within a military organization. I'm going to talk a bit about some resources that you can use with training your young people, and whether that's young people within the Air Force, because most of my work, probably similar to yours, is working with Air Commodores and 2 and 3 stars at one end, all the way down to the 17 to 23-year-old, not been in the military for very long. But a large amount of my work is with young people. And I love my job. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a brief overview of military ethics in general, some resources to get you how you can talk with young people about military ethics, and then I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about space ethics, and it is just a teaser of the sorts of things that you can use as a hook in order to talk to people about ethics and also about character, about values and so on. So let's jump straight into it. We've done the introduction. So why do we bother with military ethics in the military? If military personnel follow orders and follow the law, is there anything else to worry about? Well, I would say actually there is something to worry about, because the law sometimes is actually a fairly low standard, and sometimes we expect more of our military. It also does not protect our soldiers, sailors, airmen and women. If they are merely obeying the law, they can still be held accountable for actions, even if it's legal. So on this photo here, that's the Nuremberg war crimes trials. And these people were actually following legal orders because the Holocaust was actually legislated to make it legal within Germany. So it's problematic if we only follow orders. Similarly, in Australia, you may or may not be aware, we currently have an investigation into our Special Forces soldiers in Afghanistan, who I mean, it's still, the report is going, well, they've been saying that the report is coming soon for about the last 2 years, but I believe it is actually coming soon. And there will be a number of soldiers who have not just broken our rules of engagement, but also broken laws, and they will be tried, and we will see what the law says about that. Now, one thing that I would say is some things that are wrong are legal, such as the Holocaust, and some things that are right are not enforced by the law. So we would say that it's right that parents love their children, but we don't actually enforce it in law. We actually say they shouldn't neglect their children, but there are lots of parents who, short of physical neglect, actually don't show a lot of love to their children, but we don't actually put them up on charges. And similarly, sometimes it is right to break the law. So an example would be, say, during World War II, the people who were hiding the Jews were actually breaking the law, but it was the right thing to do. So ethics and law aren't necessarily the same thing. Similarly, on a bigger scale, not just historically, but why do we ask our soldiers, sailors, airmen and women to actually act in an ethical manner? Why do we expect them? And there are a number of reasons. One is to pass the what we call the 60 minutes test, and that is to say that we expect our soldiers to actually act in a way that's accepted by our local community. In Australia, I would say accepted by Australian society, but obviously you're on the other side of the world. So accepted by the local communities in America. We actually expect that they will act the same way, whether there is a 60 minutes camera crew there or not. Similarly, which was alluded to before when we were talking about moral injury and PTSD, we've found that if people are considering what they're doing and considering the ethical issues around what they're doing, it can actually help avoid some mental health issues, particularly in regards to moral injury and to PTSD. And there's been some really interesting research done recently about the impact of military ethics training on, for example, some of our remotely crewed drones and platforms, and how what sort of an impact that has on them in the long term on their mental health. Similarly, we worry about doing the right thing. We worry about military ethics because we have to live with our adversaries afterwards. And so it's a part of promoting peace either before or after the conflict. And finally, we do it because it is actually the right thing to do. And part of the reason we as a military exist is to uphold and to keep safe the values of our people, because if we give up those values, then what have we lost? And I would argue, so I am making the assumption that you all have a basic understanding of military ethics, and that is that just war theory. So I'll take a step back. Military ethics is split, in my view, roughly into two. We have operational ethics, so operational military ethics, which is looking at things like just war theory, jus ad bellum, jus in bello, how we actually prosecute a war. And then separate to that is garrison ethics. And as chaplains, I would say 95% of our work is actually garrison ethics. So it's more around character development and relationship issues. Either an airman or woman will come to you because their marriage has broken down, or because there is a relationship issue within a command, for example. So garrison ethics is separate. What I'm talking about at the moment is more about operational ethics, and we can talk about garrison ethics at another time. But for the moment, we're talking about operational military ethics. So what I was saying was, I'm assuming that you come with an understanding of basic military ethics in regards to operational ethics. So just war theory in relation to why a war is just when we go to it, and the importance of acting ethically and acting legally as well within a war. So proportionality, discrimination, and so on. So I'm assuming you come with that. So some resources for you. I'm just going to talk about books, case studies, movies, and cool military technology, and space is part of that, which gives us as chaplains an opportunity to sometimes teach, because sometimes I'm just making an assumption here, but sometimes we give presentations to squadrons and brigades and so on about military ethics, and some of these resources will be useful, and sometimes it's useful in our pastoral counselling conversations as well. And lastly, it's actually, some of these resources are really helpful when we're giving advice to command as well, because we can actually use the same sort of language that assists commanders to make decisions. So, books. There are 3 main books that I refer to all the time. Now, this is problematic. I'm being completely transparent. This book was written by my husband, so but I still think it's a really great book. I shouldn't say still. I think it's an excellent book. So it's actually got really good academic rigor, but it's written in a very accessible way. The best part around this is there's lots of case studies. There's an analysis of the case studies, and then at the end of the chapter, there's discussion questions. Another excellent book is The Code of the Warrior by Shannon French, and I refer people to this book all the time. This actually goes through history, looking at different codes throughout history. So, for example, the samurai and so on, looking at what rules and what values they uphold as warriors. And it links very much into our character development and also into our discussion around ethics. This picture is actually from the 2nd edition. And I'd recommend the 2nd edition because it has an added chapter on the Code of the Warrior from a Muslim perspective, which isn't in the 1st edition. And then this is a book that I'm using a lot at the moment. This is a collection of chapters written by kind of the who's who of who works in military ethics, looking at different values, or virtues. So looking at patience and loyalty and so on. And I find a great resource because you can dip in and out, and somebody will come and ask you a question, and it's an excellent resource. Now, this is, so case studies, I would actually recommend Stephen's book because there's a huge amount in there. There are a large number of case studies floating out there, and if you're ever looking for a case study to assist you, Stephen and I have a large collection of case studies that we're very happy to share. Speaking of sharing, this is another excellent resource. So this is a pack of cards, which is on the screen. This is put out by King's College London Military Ethics Department, put together by David Wetham with assistance from a large number of people. This is great because this is wrapped in plastic. I should have opened it before now. But each card actually has prompts and different questions to ask our young people to prompt discussion. So these are used in different ways by different people all across the globe. I've had chaplains play cards with them and have people go, oh, mine says this. And I've also had chaplains, everybody pick a card, and then you have to lead, that person has to lead the discussion of what's on the card. Some are obviously more applicable than others, but it's a great resource. I think it costs about £5, and they send them out from England, and the website on the bottom of the screen here, militaryethics.uk, is where you can order them. I give a lot of these out to chaplains as a great resource. Okay, movies. So I'm not going to go through a list of movies, but if you would like it, I've got a list of the 21 movies that I use quite a bit from a wide range of eras. So all the way back to Dam Busters, all the way through to, I use the Marvel movies a lot. So Captain Marvel, Infinity War, and so on. And I find that it's a great discussion tool for our young people because it gives them, in a way, a case study that they can look at. So here are my suggestions on how to use movies. My number one is don't give a lecture because often movies get young people excited and gives them an opportunity to speak, and it's not really the time to give them the ethical theory behind something. So what I recommend is you watch the movie together and then discuss things like, these are some prompt questions. What ethical issues does this raise? What is the worst or best example of an ethical dilemma? What is the worst or best example of a test of integrity? And there are some very specific definitions around those, which I'm not going to go into, but if you want to know more, I'm very happy to give a resource to Chaplain Minor on the difference between tests of integrity and ethical dilemmas. But I think the number one thing that I ask all the time is, what would you do? But most importantly, they have to tell you why, because it's really important that our young people can actually back up their thoughts and actually give us a justification or a defense of what they're saying. And this is how they actually work through what they think, and giving them a safe space. I'm going to swear a little bit because I'm Australian, and I apologize in advance. We call people who play the devil's advocate in Australia, we call them the shit stirrers. And so it's about having a safe space where you can actually talk about things and work things out that you might not necessarily agree with. And I'm talking about the young people here, but also yourselves as well. And also things, if you wanted to tie it more closely to military ethics from a theoretical perspective, you could look at asking questions about the requirements for just war theory, for example. Okay, this is why we're here, new military technologies. So when I started more than 10 years ago, teaching military ethics to our officer cadets and midshipmen. In Australia, we have the equivalent of USAFA, Annapolis and West Point is all combined. It's called ADFA, Australian Defence Force Academy. And when I started teaching there, one of the things I noticed was engineers particularly need something concrete in order to tease out ethical issues. And so if you're talking about a particular technology, it really assists them in being able to look at underlying ethical issues. It's also much more interesting, let's face it. So these are some of the areas that I've found really useful that I hope you do as well. So unmanned military vehicles. So this is remotely piloted, or whatever you would call it. This is Big Dog, which is from Boston Dynamics. There are some excellent videos from Boston Dynamics and parodies of Boston Dynamics available. I would encourage you to spend some time finding them. If you can't, feel free to contact me and I can send you some links. More autonomous vehicles. So in the 10 years that I've been teaching this, the technology has just dramatically increased. So we have things much more available now, and much smaller as well than we used to. There is a terrifying video out there using nano autonomous flying drones that act in swarms, that and it's done to encourage tighter regulation around these sorts of things. But yeah, it's an interesting parody, but it raises a lot of issues around privacy, around who has control, around who has ultimate responsibility. So cyborgs, you would think science fiction, but I've been to a number of conferences where researchers have been talking about the development in this area, and you know, it is exciting and terrifying in equal measures. Human enhancements, so external human enhancements. So, for example, the exoskeleton that helps you carry bigger packs, all the way down to internal enhancements. So there's research being done with brain implants and other things as well. Other internal enhancements might be things such as medications to assist with staying awake or falling asleep. But also there was a trial of some medications that assisted people as a preventative to not get PTSD after battle, after they've been into the battle space. The problem being that it then decreased their inhibitions and increased the chances of them committing a war crime or an atrocity, and so not used so much anymore. Non-lethal weapons, there's a really good YouTube video on non-lethal weapons by Stephen Coleman, my husband. We work closely together on non-lethal weapons. It's a TED talk that is quite old now, but is quite useful. Precision guided firearms, there are some really interesting precision guided firearms, from missiles all the way down to bullets that actually have a little camera in them and are able to hone in on a target. So I find showing that video and then discussing it afterwards is really a great opportunity to talk to young people about all sorts of things like this. Cyber warfare, and of course space. And I just realized I actually have a whole heap of links on a blog that I haven't put anything on for a really long time about new military technologies. And if Tim reminds me, I will send him also the link to that that has all of those new military technologies videos, so you don't have to go looking for them. So let's talk about space. This is why we're here. I was really excited to hear Sir talking about diversity and inclusion in regards to space. Space traditionally was originally only, at the very, very beginning, only opened up to men. But for a long time now, we've actually had women astronauts and also women engineers. We've had people from all faiths, all parts of the globe working as astronauts, but also working as technicians and so on. So one of the things that I would encourage you when you're talking about space is to use a different language to manned. So space, when we're talking about rockets or the space station, for example, we don't talk about it being manned anymore. We talk about it being crewed, or we talk about it being piloted. And it's a really small change, but it actually makes a big difference. So I encourage you to kind of think about that. Okay, so military, we're here to talk about military uses of space specifically. So when we think about military uses of space, we often think of Starship Troopers or the Battlestar Galactica, or we think of, you know, the battle cruisers in Star Wars. But the majority, from the video, as you saw before, the majority of our uses of space are actually to enable us to do our job on the ground better. In Australia, we've had, similar to you in America, it's been a horrendous year, but over the Christmas break in December, well, August, December, January, February, we had really awful bushfires. And a lot of how we actually were able to ensure that not as many people died was actually as a result of space, and specifically as a result of the intelligence that the Australian Defence Force was able to gain in regards to that. So in one way, we actually use space in our civil-military relations quite a lot. We also use space in the same way that everybody else in the Australian and the US community uses space. So for navigation, for communication, for distribution systems, for logistics. And also we use space for humanitarian disaster relief. And I'm sure you've heard the idea of a day without space would be impossible. So the way we use our phones, our electricity systems are dependent on space. Our GPS satellites make it possible for our police, fire and ambulance to be able to find us, to be able to communicate. A lot of our communications now, they're not through undersea cables. Gone are the days when Australian phone calls to America used to cost me a kidney to ring my sister-in-law in St. Louis because I had to call on an undersea cable. Now I can call on my phone and it doesn't cost anything because we have such amazing technologies, largely through the use of the internet. So it's made amazing things happen. However, what that means is we will rely very, very, very heavily on space as a community and also as the military. I'm sure you've heard of the phrase 5th generation Air Force or 6th generation Air Force. A lot of our systems now, whether it would not work without, for example, satellites and the internet, and it makes us very reliant on space, and it means that it's in a way even more important that we make sure that we look after it and we maintain our access to it. So I normally would ask the audience, who knows what this satellite is? I'd give a chocolate bar to the first person who could tell me what this is.
The space station.
Yay! I love the space station so much. So this is the International Space Station, and when you think of a satellite, this is really what, well, when I started it a long time ago, this is what I think of when I think of space stations, think of satellites. So I think of a really large satellite with big solar arrays, and in this instance, fascinatingly, different sections provided by different countries. But when you think about satellites, you usually think of, and when you think about military satellites, you also think of really large uses. But the majority of the uses that we use for the military are actually really small. So this is a CubeSat I actually took to the International Society of Military Ethics Military Space and War Conference in Colorado Springs last year. This is a CubeSat. This is actually created by the Space Department that I've worked with for a long time. And a lot of our uses of space have dramatically changed as a result of this new technology opening up. We have still got large satellites, but we are also increasingly using smaller satellites. And smaller satellites, if you want to look it up, go from something this size. So that's a 3-unit CubeSat. So it's actually 3 units put together. But sometimes they will be a single unit CubeSat. And then we've started seeing nanosats, which are the size of your thumb, and microsats as well. And so these raise a whole heap of options and opportunities, but also ethical concerns. So how do we actually know that a microsatellite or a nanosatellite that may have caused damage to one of our big military satellites, how do we know where it has come from? How do we have attribution? How can we find out whether they deliberately punched a hole in our the side of our satellite and took it out? Or, pardon me, my phone is ringing, we're just going to ignore that. Or how do we know that it was actually an accident? The great thing, and the reason this has come about, and part of the reason we are now here today, is because the cost of space operations on the ground, launching them and in space, has dramatically decreased in the last couple of years. And this is why it's no longer just our militaries and our space agencies that are actually working in space. And that's how we get the idea of it now being congested, contested, and competitive, as was spoken about before. So whilst the huge number of satellites that are now available to us in the military is a great opportunity, it actually also means that our adversaries are also able to put up swarms of satellites, for example, and that can cause issues. So we do have a large number of peaceful uses of space, but there are also, for the military, but there are also growing concerns outside of the military about some of the uses of space. And I won't go into that in depth today, but I flag it for you. Now, this is a really interesting satellite. I find this satellite fascinating. So this is actually the Russian Blagovost, I don't speak Russian, pardon me, 11L Cosmos 2520 military communication satellite. Now, the fascinating thing about this military communication satellite is it doesn't actually have any communication antennas or dishes on it. And it just happens to be in the shape of what could potentially be something that could be aimed at an installation on the ground and released. So is it a space-based weapon? Well, we don't actually know. But the consequences of space from war, war from space, or war in space could be catastrophic. And it's something that we need to consider every time we put something up in space. So one of the things that has been happening in the last few years is, as I mentioned, the cost of commercial operations particularly has dramatically decreased. But what that has meant is we now have, we're going from a situation where we have a few thousand satellites in low Earth orbit to actually having someone like Elon Musk talking about putting up tens of thousands of satellites and actually claiming whole orbits. And this is actually quite concerning for us because we are so dependent on those orbits for actually our military operations. And so it raises these questions about, well, does the military have first dibs, is the way we phrase it? Does the military have first call on orbits and on how we use space? Or should it be opened up to all commercial people and all commercial and national space operations, and the military just a part of that? It raises some really interesting questions for how we can actually navigate this. And the current world legal framework really in regards to space really wasn't set up to cope with huge numbers of commercial operators, and it was realistically set up to have only a few national space agencies. But now there are many countries that have a space agency, including Australia, which is very exciting, but it does mean that the negotiations for how we use space are much more complex and problematic. Okay, part of and what I'm leading to, the biggest problem that is associated with having these huge numbers of commercial and national and military assets in space, the biggest problem is space debris. So here we have, I'm sure you've seen this satellite many times. So this is a graph of how space debris has changed over time. So you can see back at the early 1960s, there wasn't a lot, but when we got into the Chinese ASAT test and then the collision between the US and the Russian communication satellites, this doesn't include things such as the Indian test last year, etc. So, but what it shows is how much space debris is growing and also how long it is there. So space, you like to think of things falling down, but once they hit a particular orbit, they actually don't deteriorate their orbit fast enough to decrease and fall into the atmosphere as fast as we would like. So sometimes it can take decades or even potentially 10,000 years for some higher orbit things to actually come down. The scary thing about this particular graph is it's objects that are greater than 10 centimeters in length. It's about the size of your fist or a softball. So there are this number of pieces, but there are expected, you know, now that we are actually able to track smaller pieces, we know that there are potentially hundreds of thousands of pieces of space debris. And part of the reason that's a problem is obviously something such as big as a rocket body, we can actually see coming and we can maneuver because it's going to take out maybe our communication. But something more
Chaplain Miner, I believe we've lost her.
Yes, I can, I see, sense that as well. While we're waiting for her to reestablish communication, I do not have her slide, so I can't continue the presentation. But it's what she's showing us right now, the problem of space debris. How many of us got excited when we were watching Elon Musk launch his car into space? And we have to ask ourselves the question, was this an ethical thing? Yes, it was cool, but was it at a time when there's less and less room available in space, was it ethical for Elon Musk to do such a vanity launch of launching a car that had no other benefit other than perhaps the showmanship of it? So that certainly is something that we might need to look at, and those are future issues that we need to deal with here. With that in mind, we can. I think it's probably best that we just take a few minute break right now, or if there are any specific questions that I guess that may be coming on that we could chat amongst ourselves. Any questions on Moodle that you would like to share there, Chaplain Williams?
Well, for the most part, the questions are ones that we can't deal with ourselves in with this presentation. It's far beyond our pay grade. For example, the easiest one is, what is the most unique, challenging ethical issue you have addressed as a chaplain? And that's kind of a personal thing.
Obviously, yes.
Possibly, an action may be taken, may be legal, but not ethically or morally right. Has anyone in your branch of service been prosecuted for taking an unethical action?
Very true.
You know, that's specific to Australia, but it brings to mind what's happened in the both in CAP and the Air Force and our military in general. Do we have local examples of that, local being United States?
Well, I think these are the reason for asking her to come and speak to us was to give us some opportunity to look at what are going to be the future issues, and she's coming back now.
Oh, good.
Yes. So the reason we asked her to speak was to help us look at what our cadets are going to have to deal with very, very shortly. Chaplain Coleman, can you hear us, ma'am?
And to think about the technology we're using today, that we are literally a half a world away from our guest speaker, who is in the middle of the night, I think, and doing this for us. It's phenomenal.
Yes, it's actually in the morning for her, but it's tomorrow. Tomorrow. Chaplain Coleman, you're back with us, ma'am? Chaplain Coleman? Well, we may still have some technology issues here. Besides space issues, the second most important thing that our cadets are going to have to deal with ethically is in the area of artificial intelligence. And that's going to be another conversation in the future. Uh-oh.
I think she can hear you.
I'm back.
Yay. All right.
Hey.
So this is a really good example of what happens when satellites go down. Let's do this. So, new share. I should be sharing this one. Can you see my screen now?
Partially.
Partially, okay. My apologies.
Possibly just a screen refresh might work.
Okay, thank you. And also making sure I'm on the right screen. It's because I had to go to our, okay. I am sharing the screen. Start video. Okay. New share. I'm going to go here. Pardon me. So can you see the space debris now?
It's only partial. It's about a third of your screen.
Okay, I'm going to talk you through it because otherwise you'll all fall asleep because it's getting late. So the problem of space debris, I'm just going to switch. I'm going to turn off screen sharing so that we don't lose our connection, if that's okay. Stop share. Okay. Start video. Can you see me?
Not yet.
Not yet. Oh, joys. Well, I am a long way away. I can keep talking.
Please do.
So you can help me. You can hear me. So the important thing about space debris is that it's growing and we have a huge number of players now entering the market. And so it's exceedingly problematic. So my research is actually around how space debris can be used against our space assets deliberately by non-state groups. So my research is actually a lot on space terrorism. I wouldn't recommend it as a research topic because it means you get randomly selected by the TSA every time you travel. But my goal is to actually stop space terrorism and to mitigate the risks associated with space debris being used against us as a disruptor by non-state groups. So the question is about space debris. Okay, let's just get rid of it. Sometimes it's called space debris, sometimes it's called space junk. So there's a lot of research being done on looking at a whole heap of technology. So nets, lasers, dry ice, magnets, in order to get rid of space debris, to capture it and bring it back down to Earth. Now, that is fantastic, but it's not as simple as that. So firstly, whenever the legal situation is different. So whenever you put a piece of junk into the ocean, anyone can claim it. If you put a message in a bottle, anyone can pick it up and own it. Space is not the same. Anything that Australia, for example, puts into space is owned by Australia. So somebody else can't come along and actually claim it and capture it and take it away. And it doesn't matter whether it's a whole satellite or whether it's a piece of space junk. So there's that problem to start off with. Secondly, a lot of our space debris is proprietary technology. And so a lot of countries don't actually want other countries getting hold of the advances that they have made and then bringing it back down to Earth and actually replicating it. But a bigger problem is actually anything that we use in order to clean up space debris can be used as an offensive weapon against a working satellite. And so that means that there needs to be more collaboration and communication between countries, corporations, and national space agencies, militaries, etc., to ensure that we don't, one, accidentally take out another satellite, or two, if our satellite is taken out, we can actually work out, was it an accident or was another country deliberately jamming our satellite, or did it deliberately degrade the work, the ability, the capability of our satellite? So there's a large amount of research ongoing about how we can work in this new era of space 2.0, in order to ensure that it's sustainable for the future and also so that we are able to operate within norms, within international norms. Now, my biggest concern about space debris, for example, is something called the Kessler syndrome, Kessler. And the idea is, if you've ever watched the movie Gravity, it's a little bit based on that. So it's the idea that there is a tipping point at which we have so much space debris that it will have a cascade effect, and it will take out whole zones of orbits, making it very difficult for us to maintain our space operations for the military, but also for regular corporations as well. And so this is part of the reason why space is so fragile, and we need to ensure that we're actually looking after it. Now, the last thing that I just wanted to conclude on is something that Sir mentioned before in regards to remotely piloted aircraft and the psychological impact that that can actually have on our, particularly our airmen and women. And the idea around this is the idea of remote war. So space is the ultimate remote war. It's unlikely that our big space battles will be done with people in jetpacks with really cool uniforms. It's much more likely to be remotely piloted, much more likely to be autonomous, for example, because it's cheaper and easier to actually put a robot or an autonomous weapon or actor into space, because they don't need to be, they can't get sick, they don't need to sleep, and ultimately they don't need to breathe air. So we don't have to send oxygen and food and so on. We have to send up fuel, but we don't have as many problems. But it raises a whole heap of ethical questions around who is in control. So who is making sure that the norms of war, so whether that's the laws of armed conflict or whether that's our just war theory in regards to jus in bello and jus ad bellum, are actually being maintained. And lastly, it raises huge issues for us as chaplains, because it psychologically is different and can still break people in a similar way to being involved in a regular operation. It has similar kind of impacts, but complicated by the fact that those sorts of people are driving home at night and reading books to their kids and having to maintain relationships within their families in a much more longer term sustained kind of way, and the impact that that has on their mental health. They're not deployed to Afghanistan, and most of the time they're not deployed to Afghanistan and piloting a drone from a bunker, for example. They're actually at home, because back in America and Australia, because we don't need to put them in harm's way. But it raises a whole heap of additional questions around how we actually, as chaplains, reach out to those people. So I'm actually going to leave it there, because I don't want to lose the internet connection again. But if you have any questions, I'd be interested to hear what they are.
Ma'am, at this time, I'm afraid we're because of the lost connection, we're kind of at the end of our time here, and we have one of our young people actually going to speak to us in about 2 to 3 minutes. So please do hang on.
Which is fantastic.
And for everyone else, I'll just ask us to hang on. And thank you so very much. And we will get one of those cool Civil Air Patrol Chaplain Corps coins to you as well as part of
Oh!
And